Next talk is minimal requirements for productive compositional signaling.
All right. Okay. So today I'll give you a talk on the emergence of productive compositional signaling, and we'll explain each of these words as we go along, so don't worry about that. And we're returning to language games again after this brief intermezzo. So in general, what we view in this work as being crucial is that semantic structure is at least partially a consequence of the interaction of people actually communicating. And we are particularly interested in terms of the pressures that apply for the language to be effective. So on the one hand side, language needs to be simple enough to be learnable. On the other hand side, it needs to be expressive enough to actually talk about all the things we want to talk about. So a very simple language to learn would have, for example, a single word. But on the other hand, that's not very expressive. And a very expressive language may have one word for every single situation we may want to talk about, but that's hardly learnable. And one way in which language can cope with these two pressures is to have a compositional structure. That is, that the meaning of a complex expression is composed by the meaning of their parts and the way they're put together, okay? And that's what we're interested in seeing, interactions in which this kind of structure arises through interlocutors trying to agree on something. And in particular, we are trying to address two questions in this talk. One is what is actually needed for a compositional system to emerge, and the second one is what is needed for it to be productive. And to be productive means essentially that I can generalize what I learn about one combination to other combinations I may not have seen before. And this is important because even if we have a systematic structure where each constituent agrees on the meaning of the complex expression, we still may not learn how to combine new items that we haven't seen in combination before. So if I know how to combine red and door into red door, this may or may not tell me anything about how to combine green and bike. And that's the aspect we're interested in if we're actually trying to come up with novel ways of using language that we haven't witnessed before. And we want to do so without appealing to saliency or to iconicity or to hyperrationality. So we're assuming very, very naive agents and without any help of the environment on how to bootstrap the structure itself. And that will lead us to looking at language as a convention under minimal cognitive assumptions. So we're trying to make our agents as naive as possible. How do we do this? Well, we'll start out with Lewis's notion of what a convention is. And a convention is simply some arbitrary agreement by which most players in a population act most of the time, and for which there is no particular reason to act in a different way than the one of the convention. A simple idea is to look at traffic. We could either all drive on the right-hand side or on the left-hand side, and both of these are fine as long as we're all agreeing on one side instead of the other side. So there is little reason for me to drive on the left if everyone's driving on the right, at least most of the time. In fact, this may be dangerous otherwise. But it's arbitrary in terms of both of these are fine as conventions in themselves. And language, up to a certain degree, is also conventional like that. It does not matter whether I call a dog or a cat, as long as my linguistic community agrees on this being the name for the entity I'm referring to. So how do we formalize this? Well, we'll be using signaling games, which is just an upshot of the language games we saw before. So we have two players, a sender and a receiver. This could be whole populations, but in this case, we'll only look at two interlocutors. The sender has a set of types, that is private information that he may possibly want to talk about. He has a set of messages that he can send to communicate that meaning to the receiver. And the receiver has a set of acts to perform upon receiving the message. And that's how we check whether they actually understood each other. We'll assume a joint utility function, which means we gain nothing from deceiving our interlocutors. So we're trying to agree on meaning. We're not trying to trick each other. And we'll assume no signaling costs, so no message is more expensive than any other message. And it's commonly assumed, and I will assume the following, that all types are equally likely. So I'm as likely to talk about cats than I am to talk about dogs. And in the simplest case, we are looking at a binary utility function where for each type there is exactly one act that maximizes the utility for the players. So there is exactly one action that is the right one for any kind of meaning that I may want to convey, and otherwise we get nothing from the game. So this is the setup. We start on the left-hand side, where simply some choices made of what the sender may possibly want to talk about. Then the sender is of one of two types in this particular case. So again, cat or dog, one might think. The sender can send one of two possible messages, and the receiver will receive these two messages and then will act upon them. And then we simply compute the payoff whether this was the correct act to perform, depending on the type. Now, what a convention is simply pure strategies for the sender and receiver that will maximize the utility. So essentially, it's the strategy that will ensure that we're actually communicating as best as possible, given the setup. In the case in which we have two meanings, two messages, and two acts, we have two possible conventions that will ensure that we are actually understanding each other. And both of these are possible. In this sense, they are, again, arbitrary, because the meaning of the message does not depend on the message does not depend on the meaning of the type. So we could either send message 1 for type 1 or message 2 for type 2, as long as the receiver knows about this convention and acts accordingly. Okay? Now this is essentially already the solution for one of these games, and what I'm interested in is not the solution concept, but actually how we arrive to that concept in the first place. So we'll start with a clean slate, and we need to learn something. And for this, we'll use a very simple form of reinforcement learning called rod-error reinforcement learning, which is simply reinforce whatever was successful in the past, right? That's simple. We may or may not have a punishment parameter. In this case, I will not assume to have one. The idea behind this particular kind of reinforcement learning is that it's very simplistic, so we do not have to make many assumptions about how sophisticated the agents are. The second one is people playing these games in laboratory setups actually produce data that is close enough to what the algorithm predicts. So how does this look? Well, we need to keep track of the accumulated rewards, that is, on how well any combination of types and messages or messages and acts does. And we'll simply add at the end of each round of the game essentially 1 point or the utility itself to the accumulated rewards, and that will make the players more likely to do the same thing given the same state. Okay, so I assume this is something you are all familiar with. Right, so at the end of the game, we simply update the accumulated rewards for for example, the sender selected message J given type Ti, then we'll simply add the accumulated, the utility of the game to the accumulated rewards of this particular pair. Okay, what we want is not these meanings that stand on their own, but we want to talk about structure, about constituent structure, and about meaning being related to each other and forms being related to each other. So we need to add a little bit more structure to the meaning and the messages we are considering, and for this we simply add some metrics on the set of types, messages, and acts. Based on this metric, we can define a similarity relation. You can imagine if we're talking about strings, we just use some string-based metrics. If we're talking about Euclidean space being the meaning space, then we use Euclidean distance or any other distance that we want to look at. For simplicity, we'll assume that there is an isometry between the set of types and the set of actions. That is, we can measure the success of any particular action for any particular type given the distance that they have in the set. And in case we have such a graded utility function, we can simply take the distance to be what determines how well we're doing. Now, this in itself will not give us compositional structure. We also need to add a few assumptions on the learning mechanism. And what we will do is to use spillover reinforcement learning, which essentially means we will not only add rewards to the states action pairs that were selected in the game, but we'll also spill over a proportion of the rewards to other pairings in proportion to their similarity to the ones in play. So you can assume if T1 and MA were selected, then we'll add to the rewards of other pairings that are similar to the ones in play. And that's all what this function is doing over here. So instead of simply adding the utility, we also add a factor of how similar any pairing is to the ones that were selected. The parameter pi simply is there for convenience so that we can actually control how much is spilling over to different pairings. And this will make constituent-based similarity more likely to conventionalize in the game. It's not a given that this will happen because we're always reinforcing multiple pairings at the same time. We're not only reinforcing the pairing that essentially is the right one for the compositional structure, but any other combination that is similar to the ones in play. So this may or may not actually be detrimental for the success of the convention that we arise at. So we'll see this in a second. Now, as I said before, structure is not necessarily enough if we want to account for the creative aspect of compositionality. So we also want to have something like a generalization. And for this, we need to take into account not only the pairs that were selected, but also structurally similar pairs. So we'll consider the similarity set for any element P to be all the things that P is similar to. And we'll say that two elements P and Q are similar if and only if for each of the elements in the similarity set of the one, there is an element in the set of the other such that the distances match up. Again, depending on how strict we want to be, we may or may not allow for a little wiggle room with some small epsilon here and there. And since we're always comparing pairings, so types and messages or messages and acts for sender and receiver respectively, we'll say that two state action pairs have the same pattern if and only if they have the same structure in terms of the pointwise structures. So the intuition behind this is if I know how to combine that A and B form AB, and I know that C and D have the same structure as A and B, then if I know how to combine A and B, I also learn essentially for free that it's quite likely that C and D combine in the same way, okay? And again, we simply add that to our update function. So now we are, on the one hand side, we are reinforcing over similarity, so that's over similarity in the space of the meanings or on the forms. And we're also reinforcing over things that are structurally similar. And here again, we are, in this case, using the same parameter for both of these, so this is simply pi. One may or may not use different parameters. For the evaluation, in this case, I simply use the same one, but this is only for simplicity, it's not necessary. And in case any pair is neither similar nor structurally similar to the pair in the game, nothing happens, so we do not update that. The results I'm going to present are based on string-based representations, but I also have results on more interesting representations using subsets of R2 and R3. In case you're interested in that, we can talk about it afterwards. So what we use in the paper itself is a very simple scenario. So we had 6 different meanings that one may possibly want to talk about, and 6 different messages. And we looked at 3 different scenarios, one in which we already had mappings for the simplex elements. So we already, for example, had a mapping that MA should be the right message for T1, MB for T2, and MC for T3, for example. And what we wanted to check is whether this kind of very simple learning mechanism can bootstrap the compositional structure that is in accordance to mapping, for example, MDA to T01, since MA is mapped to T1. Scenarios 2 and 3 ask a different question. Here we're interested in how the priors that we have in the first place, so the conventions we already have, will influence the conventions we end up with. So we compared having one prior association between one simplex and complex element. So for example, having a convention for MA T1 and MDA T01. And for scenario number 3, we had 2 unrelated simplex expressions. So we already had as a given a mapping, for example, of MA and T1 and MB and T2. We made a couple of runs. I will just summarize this in a second. 100 runs from iterations of 10 to the power of 3 to 10 to the power of 6 iterations. And we compared, in this case, very small values of pi, but this still adds a lot of noise to the game itself. Pi being equal to 0, this is important. This gives us the baseline, because pi equal to 0 means that we will get simple reinforcement learning. Essentially, that's the baseline because it doesn't add any of the assumptions I just talked about, okay? And what we're interested in is, on the one hand side, how many conventions we get, that is, how many essentially optimal linguistic systems we get from these simple interactions. On the other hand, how many of these conventions are compositional. And we can see that for scenarios 1 and 2, on the one hand side, if we compare the baseline to any higher value of pi, we see that in terms of the conventions, there is no effect, so that's good because we are not doing worse than using the simple reinforcement learning, so they're still learning an optimal language. On the other hand, we have a lot more compositional conventions, and that's also what we expected in the first place. The interesting aspect is a comparison between scenarios 1 and 2 and scenario 3, because in scenario 3, where we had no structure to start with, they actually did a lot worse. So on the one hand side, they reached less conventions than the baseline. On the other hand, they didn't reach more compositional conventions than the baseline. And what this tells us is essentially, if we have a learning mechanism that is propagating structure, then it doesn't help if we do not have structure in the first place to start with, because the players will simply explore for a longer time possible structural, possible compositional mappings, and they will get trapped in suboptimal pooling equilibria without reaching a good language system. There are a few other smaller results. On the one hand side, if we compare having reinforcement over similarity, reinforcement over patterns and similarity, and simple reinforcement, then we see that it takes less time for the simple learning mechanism to reach a convention, and it takes longer for the similarity signalers and the pattern signalers. Again, this is to be expected because we are adding more fractions of the rewards to different pairings, so this will just take longer in terms of exploration. On the other hand side, if we already have a convention with a certain structure, it takes less time to reach a convention if we already have the structure in place. So then the picture goes the other way around. If I already have a compositional convention, then if we add new elements that are in accordance with this structure, we're a lot faster to agree on how to call these particular meanings. And that is exactly what the literature would predict, is that compositionality is useful to cope with novel meanings that we may want to talk about. Okay? Again, this is under the motto of less precision, more speed. Obviously, since we are always spilling over things, exploration never fully ends, which means that we always have a small probability of trying out novel things. This is not necessarily a bad thing, and we'll see in a second that, in particular for natural language, there are other mechanisms that Paul will talk about to correct these kind of noisy and errors in between, so we can actually improve on that with other mechanisms. Just to summarize, in this setting, in a sense, little is needed for compositional structure. On the one hand side, we simply said, try to do similar things for similar states. On the other hand, we have said that for similar structure, you also should do structurally similar things. And we see that this time to precision trade-off is also what is predicted by a lot of literature in terms of what generalization is useful for. So we can deal with a large space, but we're also adding a little bit of noise here and there. So on the one hand side, it's positive. On the other, it's negative, depending on what the goal is. For large environments, this is quite useful. Thank you.
Time for question.
Thank you, Thomas. Did you try this with the population of agents, or was it always two?
In this case, the results are always two. So it's essentially, it's a local, they're locally learning their own language.
Yeah, I think it would be very interesting actually to extend this to a population.
Yeah.
Because in a language game with two agents, almost any kind of alignment you use will lead to shared language.
Yeah.
If you extend it to a population, it's nice to see which kinds of alignment actually lead to shared language in a population in which number of interactions.
Yeah. So I have analytic results on the evolutionary stability of these games. I do not have them in terms of the adaptive dynamics. So I can essentially tell you what kind of strategies are the ones that are stable in the population, but I haven't tried out like how long it takes them to reach these and whether they reach them. Obviously, in this very simple learning scenario, I'm quite sure they will fail a lot, and only a small fraction will actually be useful as a language. But yeah, I agree, this will be quite interesting.
So, very interesting paper. What do you think is exactly the notion, I mean, you know, at a more conceptual level, the notion of compositionality that your model embeds? So what type of compositionality should we think of? What type of composition?
Yeah, this really depends on the kind of metric and the kind of space we're looking at. So that's
what I'm saying. The ones you used, what do you think they correspond to in real language or in? So is it more kind of, you know, is it something like lexical, like building compounds of words, or is it?
Oh, I mean, at this level, it could be anything. It's abstract enough for anything. The question, conceptually, the interesting question is whether they are actually learning the functions to combine them, because they're, in a sense, they are not. I mean, they do not have representations for functions to combine two things, which is what the theoretical literature actually assumes. They are learning these combinations implicitly, but in terms of what this corresponds to, it could, in principle, be either morphemes or essentially at any linguistic level in principle, because this is flexible enough for that. Could it be?
I mean, I'm wondering. The specific thing I'm wondering about is could they be, for example, some things that denote complex sequences of actions?
Yeah.
For example, when you try to agree on something in pragmatics.
Well, I mean, in this setup, there is absolutely no reasoning. I mean, that's part of
No. But I'm saying, you know, I'm trying to determine what your constraints for combining things, what kinds of relations they allow and what they don't allow.
Yeah. This really depends on exactly the model you're looking at. I think this is, at this level, it's general enough to allow for a lot, but obviously you need to tweak things a little bit depending on what you're looking at.
The second question is, so you kind of say that these are the minimal requirements. Did you test taking out some and then it really didn't work?
So the argument for, or why these are minimal is because if you do not have, on the one hand side, a notion of things being related, you do not get structure, so you do not get compositionality. So that's, you need that. On the other hand, you need them to be sensitive to the structure itself, to learn it. And that's all the assumptions I'm putting in there. Obviously, whether this is the minimal formalization of these ideas, that's not what I'm claiming. So that's a different kind of question. But these are the assumptions that have to be there in the first place. So it's not so much. Yeah, so I don't have any proof that these are the minimal assumptions. But
I was just wondering, experimentally, you could just take away one thing or the other and see what.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it also depends on how you. I mean, it depends on how you evaluate these kind of things. Like what in a sense you could take out the generalization and you still get compositional structure, but they cannot use it. And if you cannot use it, then it's why should it be there in the first place? So it's sort of you're vacuously fulfilling the formal requirement of compositionality with only one of these assumptions. But if they cannot use it to generalize to novel stimuli, then it's not doing anything for you. And that's, yeah, so in a sense you could do it with only one assumption. On the other, it doesn't help you.
We have time for questions?
Was I so fast?
Well, I have one.
Yeah.
It's about, you say metric spaces, I think you mean similarity? When you're saying metric spaces?
Yes.
Title?
So, I mean, to define similarity, we need some notion of distance.
Yeah. Of course, you're in a very abstract setting here,
Yeah.
but once you try to apply something like that to a particular domain or even different, you said different levels of language, it could be applied in principle, but then the similarity is very domain dependent in some way. So you would need some way to acquire or discover or come up to an agreement of when things should be considered similar or not.
Oh, so you're saying essentially, yeah, so I'm stipulating that they do have the same notion of similarity, essentially, the agents.
Yeah. I'm saying that I don't think when you try to apply to a real world, that would be not an assumption you make. It's something that has to be evolved or developed or learned or agreed upon in some way. You cannot. It's like case-based reasoning. Analogy. It's you compare things that are similar, but what's the meaning of similarity is the big question in each particular debate.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting one, and actually that would be interesting to have. I mean, I don't know how to learn this from scratch, but one could in principle pit different similarity measures against each other, and then they having to come up with the one that they agree on using. That's one way I would see to expand this. I don't know how you would go about agreeing on a similarity measure without having any notion of a similarity measure in the first place. So this seems that goes a lot into the domain of grounding, which is really not my expertise. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts about that. We can discuss this later, but it's an interesting question.